Right. And then I will get started with our introduction of our speaker today. Today we have Dave Carter. Dave Carter serves as Director of Regional Technical Assistance Coordination for the Flower Hill Institute. What a title. An Indigenous led nonprofit organization coordinating the Technical Assistance Network USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service has established to support producers seeking to create a more resilient, diversified, and equitable meat and poultry processing system in the United States. Woof, that's awesome.
That's a mouthful. Yeah.
It is. From 2001 to March 2022, Carter served as executive director of the National Bison Association, where he worked to strengthen production and marketing systems for the North American bison ranchers. He was also a leader in the 6-year campaign that resulted in bison being designated as the national mammal of the United States. Carter has a deep background in natural food marketing and agricultural public policy. His marketing experience includes work in natural meat, cheese, and pet food products. He is the former chair of USDA's National Organic Standards Board and later helped gain regulatory approval for non-GMO labeling of meat, poultry, and dairy products sourced from animals fed diets without genetically modified ingredients. Dave and his wife, Sue, have a herd of bison operated in partnership with 2 other ranching families outside of Denver. So after that awesome background, without further ado, I want to introduce Dave Carter. Take it away, Dave.
Oh, well, thanks for having me this morning. And I love the topic that you invited me to talk about, which is the role of private ranchers in restoring bison. That's a topic I could go on for a couple of hours. And fortunately, we're parked outside of a place called Casa Bonita right now because I have 2 granddaughters that are going to show up here for a birthday lunch at the top of the hour. So they'll keep me short. But anyway, yeah, we'll start off with a few slides. When we talk about bison restoration, I always say that the story goes back about 200,000 years. And, you know, we go back. I just think it's so fascinating that the precursors of today's bison wandered in from Siberia across the land bridge during the last ice age, and these were huge animals, bison priscus, and they were kind of solitary animals. They really weren't herd animals. And then as the ice age kind of intensified, they even got bigger. We saw the bison latrophons, which is that picture up in the upper right-hand corner. I had a horn span of could be 6 to 8 feet on it. But then a couple of things started to happen. Was that the ice age started to recede, the climate started to warm, and predators learned to hunt in packs, and that included humans. And so being this big solitary lumbering animal wasn't an advantage anymore. It was a disadvantage. And so your choices were you either went extinct or you started to downsize and adapt. And of course, the woolly mammoth made the choice to go extinct, I guess. But the bison started to go through this gradual downsizing to get to the animal that we know today. And so, you know, their behavior, they evolved in concert with the North American grasslands, which are about 40% of the North American continent. And the grasslands evolved to have that continuous interaction with grazing animals. Yeah, there were deer and elk and antelope out there, but bison were the keystone species. And so the whole environment that we had was emerged with this interaction with these large herds of ungulates, of bison, that would come in and graze real hard for a few days and then move off, and the land would restore. And in the meantime, you had the wallowing and the hoof action and the manure and the urine and the hooves pushing the seeds down. And so it was a real robust environment. Well, along came the European settlers, and the actual decline of bison really began as soon as the European settlers hit and they introduced guns and horses to the Native Americans, because now they got more sophisticated in their hunting techniques, and rather than just running them off a cliff, they could selectively hunt, and particularly in the fall when they wanted to get fat in their diet, they would hunt the females, because those females were putting on fat to get through the winter with their calves. And so you saw that decline, start to go down. And then there was just the ultimate decimation of bison. For sport hunting, there was a government policy to deny the indigenous people their food sources. Often overlooked is the fact that European cattle brought in diseases that bison were naive to. And so the diseases probably killed as many bison as the hunting did. But, you got down to this point where the bison were gone, and you can pull up that next one here, that next slide. I don't think you can't have a presentation on bison without having this picture. I think everybody's seen this picture. And this is not a unique situation. This is very common. I was just reading a book the other day that, over about a 5-year span, they were hauling hundreds and thousands of pounds of bones a year away to be made into fertilizer. And so, it was just this ultimate collapse to the point where finally, you can show that next one, that I'd put the dart at about 1885, that we were down to about 750 animals left alive in all of North America. Incredible, teetering on the brink of extinction. Well, if you read a lot of books out there, and a lot of the literature and a lot of the TV stories that have been done or documentaries on bison, they talk a lot about the restoration that was led by Dr. William Hornaday and Teddy Roosevelt. And that's really an interesting story because Dr. Hornaday, he was a taxidermist, and he was hired by the Smithsonian Museum. And it's interesting that in the late, in the 1870s and the like, the theory was that if a species was about to go extinct, museums would hire a taxidermist to go out and hunt all of them that they could find and create dioramas so that future generations could see them. And so Hornaday went out to Montana, spent about 3 months. It took him 3 months to find 22 bison that he took back and created an exhibit for the Smithsonian, had a couple live ones that he had out in a pen at the Smithsonian. But then, he began to think that maybe there was a better way to do it than maybe preserving the animals in a zoo would be something. So ultimately, he became the director of the Bronx Zoo. And Teddy Roosevelt, who had been out hunting bison in a previous life, began to think about conserving the bison. And there was a private rancher in New Hampshire, Austin Corbin, who had heard and was talking about the need to preserve them. So they created the American Bison Society in 1905 to restore the bison. And there's a lot of people will talk about Hornaday and Roosevelt and the American Bison Society and restoring the bison. But they don't realize that restoration was already underway. Go ahead with the next one there, and this will be the last slide, and then I'll come back on and just visit. But, starting in the 1880s, there was a handful of very unique individuals who began to gather up the remnants of the bison and to restore them. And up in the upper left-hand corner there is Samuel Walking Coyote. And he was a Penda Orel, I cannot pronounce it, but he was a Native American, indigenous. He was on the Blackfeet tribe reservation in Montana. And he decided to walk off and visit another reservation. And as he went along, he fell in love with a woman. He was already married. That was the problem. But he married this other woman. And in his tribe, polygamy was not prohibited, but it was certainly frowned on. And also the reservation where he lived was under the jurisdiction of the Jesuits. And he knew that he was going to be in deep trouble if he showed back up with 2 wives. And so up in a canyon, he found about 5 calves. And he thought that if he took these bison calves to the Jesuit priests, they would show him mercy. Well, he took the calves to the Jesuit priests. They didn't show him any mercy. They still flogged him, but they let him keep the calves. And then ultimately, his animals were blended in. There was a couple of ranchers there in Montana. The Pablo and Allard, and it was Michael Pablo and his partner Charles Allard, and they began to gather up bison. And when we talk about the early ranchers restoring bison, I find it fascinating that it's interlaced with their wives, and B, with indigenous. Many of them had married native women, and Charles Pablo was married to a native woman, and so they began to gather up some remnants there. Well, elsewhere, and the Pablo Allard herd is the herd that you see down below Walking Coyote. There was up in Canada a guy by the name of James McKay, about 350 pounds, bear of a man, that began to gather up the ones in Canada. And then next to him down in South Dakota, Fred Dupree, and then later Scotty Phillips, who's in the picture there, who was known as the Buffalo King, gathered up herds there. And Scotty Phillips ultimately had about 800 animals. And then the upper right is a famous picture of Charles Goodnight. People know him from the Goodnight Loving Cattle Trail. And he was a famous rancher down in South Dakota, or not South Dakota, but down in Texas. And one is the folks that saved the southern herd. When the railroads went through, the bison had been split into the northern herds and the southern herd. And again, Charles Goodnight, his wife, Mary, was instrumental in saying she could hear these calves bawling at night out there. And she said, go out, we got to save these animals. And then finally in the lower right-hand corner is Buffalo Jones, who was a pretty colorful character. Some people say he was a con man, but he was kind of a circus guy, a performer. And, he was one who led the whole idea that maybe we should crossbreed these animals. And that's an interesting part of the restoration story is, people talk about, well, there's bison out there or buffalo out there with cattle genetics in them. And when the average consumer or person hears that, they think, well, gosh, these bison ranchers have got a black Angus cow behind the barn that they're, putting on their females to crossbreed them. And that's not what happened at all. What happened is in the 1880s, back when these folks were just gathering up the remnants of the bison, there was a huge historic blizzard that hit the Great Plains. They still call it the Great Kill-Off. And at that time, the cattle had come in. These English barons had these big ranches out west, and they were just running the cattle out there. And this blizzard came through, this series of blizzards killed their cattle, decimated the cattle herds. But these ranchers noticed that these bison that had been gathered up did just fine. And so they thought, maybe if we crossbred these animals, we could create a hybrid that would be winter hardy. And so they wanted to create Catalo. And Buffalo Jones did it. Scotty Phillips did a little bit. But what they found was you didn't get the hybrid vigor. You actually got the worst. You got a first-generation bull that was sterile. You had females that had calving problems and bad attitudes. And so they quit doing it. In fact, Scotty Phillips, when he acquired some more bison, they brought in some purebred ones and some that had been crossbred. And he just flat out said, these crossbreds are not worth a damn. They just were worthless. And so they quit doing it. It was a brief time that they did some of that. And so some of those genetics are still in there. But I find it interesting that then the challenge that they faced as they were restoring the bison was they got to a certain point that they couldn't do anything with them. And this is in 1905, about the same time that the American Bison Society was being formed to save the bison. Charles Goodnight spent about $7,000 to film. This was the beginnings of the film industry, and he filmed a big buffalo shoot, a big buffalo hunt that he thought he could market this footage. He never found a market for it, but he spent about $7,000 to do it. Scotty Phillips, when his herd kind of outgrew, he brought in and had a buffalo hunt. Brought in some of the tribal folks from the surrounding reservations and did that because there just wasn't a place for these animals to go. So when you think about it, we went through the early part of the 20th century with just these scattered animals then going out to some of the public places, the Wichita Mountains, and of course you had Custer State Park that was shown, and Wind Cave and Yellowstone, the Bison, National Bison Range up in Montana. So you have these little clusters there. And then particularly up in the Dakotas, you started to see there were some, characters, like you tend to get in the Dakotas, that kind of ranched these bison, had them private. Well, they went through, and before I jump ahead to the initial Custer State Park sale, it was interesting because when you take a look then at the time when they were scattered about in a handful of ranchers and Custer Park had them, Custer Park even had a slaughter plant on the park where they would slaughter the animals and market the meat. And what was interesting was that during World War II, a lot of their meat went to New York City because during the war, there was rationing. You were rationed. You were limited to the amount of beef that you could buy. But bison weren't subject to any of the rationing. So a lot of animals were processed at the slaughter plant at Custer State Park and shipped back to New York in the midst of World War II. So finally, you got to the point where in the 1960s, Custer State Park decided to have an auction. And I believe it was 1966. I still, in my office, I have one of the sale notices from that first sale. And if I had to put a flag in where the start of today's commercial bison business began, that's where I'd plant it. That was really the first time that animals went out and began to go out to build private herds. And there was a famous CBS correspondent. I'm trying to think, I forgot his name. He retired a few years back, but he was a local TV journalist in the Dakotas, or it was beginning with CBS News, and he actually did a story on that first Custer auction. I was lucky enough to get a DVD recording of that from CBS that I have in my office. I had to sign an agreement that I would only show it once. So I've made a point of only showing it once to anybody I ever showed it to. But it's really fascinating. But it was there that you begin to see some commercial bison go out. Well, that was great. Bison were being sold as a novelty at Wall Drug, and local fire departments would buy a bull and have a bison roast, and it was just a novelty. But really then in the late 70s and the early 80s, that's when some ranchers got together and said, you know what? This deserves to be more than just a novelty. This is an incredible animal. It creates really high quality meat. We need to build this business. And so that's when there was a concerted effort to begin to build the bison business. And at that time, there were two organizations representing bison. Back in the 70s, the National Buffalo Association had started and was formed to promote the American bison. But by the 1980s, there was a lot of concern from other ranchers that the National Buffalo Association was kind of a good old boys club, that they were sort of exclusive and were kind of locking out some of the upstarts. So there was an alternative organization called the American Bison Association that was founded. And so for years, you had these two associations competing. Well, the American Bison Association then in the mid 80s put out the first edition of what has become the Bison Producer's Handbook. At that time, it was called the Bison Breeder's Handbook. And it was just a insert in their magazine. It was probably about a 10-page insert into the magazine that the American Bison Association published. And I had a chance to go back and read that a few years ago. And it's interesting. When I read that, it was all lessons on how to raise bison. And when I read that, I thought, if I was going to entitle this anything, I would call it Everything I Know About Raising Cattle. Because the contents of that were you need to have higher, sturdier fencing, you need to have really durable handling equipment, but other than that, treat them like rambunctious cattle. Brand them, dehorn them. They even tried castrating them, for a while. And so it was, let's just treat them as a shaggy version of cattle. Well, fortunately, a lot of the ranchers began to listen to the bison. I always say we started to listen to the bison. And we began to recognize that Mother Nature did a really, really good job perfecting this animal over thousands and thousands of years. And so maybe the best thing we could do is not screw it up. And I would say Ted Turner was probably instrumental in that. In that Ted came in and when he started his ranchers, I always like to say he did two things. Number one was he hired the best people he could find to run his ranches. And number two is he told them to share whatever they learned with everybody else. And so they began to look at, how do we manage this animal and do it? Well, during the 90s, that was the time then when there was a lot of excitement about the bison business. People were jumping in. There weren't a lot of animals to be had at the time, so the price of animals was going up. People were bidding on animals. And so then when Ted came in and started buying animals for his ranch, the prices really started going up. And then a few other billionaires said, well, if Ted's onto something, he must know something's going on. Let's jump in too. And so by, the mid to late 90s, the bison business had really become a pyramid scheme. You could buy a bred heifer for, $2,800 and have the calf out of her and sell it for $2,500 and turn around and sell her for $3,000, it was all. And in the meantime, the co-op in North Dakota had started. And when it was started, the philosophy was this meat is so great, people are going to beat a path to our doors. So we need to guarantee the producers a good price to deliver their animals to us, which they did. The problem was marketing the meat wasn't that easy. It was really difficult because people would still perceive bison as gamey or tough or don't eat it, it's endangered, whatever. And so by the late 90s, the price of live animals was stupid crazy high. The co-op in North Dakota had freezers that were bursting with meat. And that's when the whole business fell off a cliff. In 1999, the Grand Champion Bull at the Gold Trophy Show and Sale sold for $99,000. I came on board in 2001. The first Gold Trophy Show and Sale I went to in 2002, the Grand Champion Bull sold for $5,800. I mean, it had just cratered like that. And so there was a decision. The Wall Street Journal ran a front page story. It was entitled, "Does Anybody Want a Buffalo?" Because ranchers were just liquidating and, going out of business so rapidly. And so there was a concerted effort. When I was brought on, the president of the Bison Association at the time, Merle Moss, made it clear. He said, we're not going to talk to people about building fence or building their herds. We're going to talk about the meat. We've got to market the meat. We've got to build this with the consumer. And so we started to try and figure out, how do we do that? And it was a couple years later that we had a strategic planning retreat for the Bison Association. And another guy was president at the time, because the Bison Association, you're only president for a couple years. But Mike Duncan was the president at the time. And we had a planning retreat up at his ranch in northern Colorado. And I'll never forget that Mike opened that planning retreat with the board of directors by saying, let's make a decision right now that this animal will never be a commodity. We will never be a commodity, because a commodity is about producing the biggest quantity at the cheapest price, at the generic quality. And he said, we have something special here. And I think we can build this business by connecting with the consumers, with the people out there who appreciate how we raise the animal and the quality of the meat, and how this animal, protects the environment. And that's really the path that the National Bison Association has been on over the last 20 plus years, is to talk about the environmental qualities, the nutritional qualities of the meat, and the fact that it's utterly delicious. And that's worked very well. We've had our ups and downs. The bison business has ebbed and flowed. Droughts have been a big, challenge through the years. Maybe a challenge again this year. Who knows? But we began to recognize that, yes, this animal's something special. We never really want to see a McBison burger in McDonald's. We don't want to see bison at the all-you-can-eat buffet for, $10. That we're going to connect with people who appreciate this. And so we've started to take a look at how do we maximize, how do we build the business in the best and most sustainable way. And that gets back to recognizing how this animal evolved in concert with the ecosystem that we're in. Is that when I talk to the ranchers today, nearly every one of them is saying, I want to make my grassland, I want to make my pastures healthier than when I got this place. I want my animals to be healthier. I want my animals to have the best quality life that they can have, right up until what we call that one bad day. And so that's what we're seeing, and I think that we're in a really, really strong footing going forward. We've got great organizations out there. The NBA is continuing to show great leadership and for the bison business. What was the Buffalo Museum, now the Discovery Center's, doing a great job. We've got the National Buffalo Foundation that is working with the South Dakota State and the Center of Excellence for Bison Studies. And so we have a lot of folks who, come together with different perspectives, but we share a love of the animal. And that's one of the things that we noted when we started the campaign to get bison as the national mammal, was that there were the conservation herds out there, and there were the tribal herds, and there were the private herds. And so for so many years, we operated in silos, not only separate from each other. A lot of times we shot arrows at each other and threw rocks at each other. And we began to recognize that, we have these different approaches, but at the heart of it is this magnificent animal that we all love. And Mike Faith, who was the vice chair of the Intertribal Buffalo Council and was chair of the Standing Rock Nation, when we started that, he pulled me aside one day, and one night we were at the Dakota Territories Buffalo Association meeting, and he said, Dave, he said, we'll always have 20% of the issues that we disagree on, but why do we let that keep us from working on the other 80%? And that's really what brought the private ranchers, the tribes, and the conservation community to come together in a concerted effort to make bison the national mammal. And I think that's what's contributed to ongoing communication. The fact that the Intertribal Buffalo Council has a MOU partnership with the National Bison Association, and that we work very closely with the Nature Conservative and World Wildlife Fund and others to build the herds on tribal lands, on public lands, and on private lands. So anyway, that's more than you probably wanted to hear, but yeah, that's why I'm excited and to be a part of, private ranchers restoring bison herds.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. That was very thorough and wonderful. I loved it. So I have a few questions. We have about 15 minutes for questions, but does anyone else have a question first? Feel free to come off mute or go ahead, Ed.
First, thanks, Dave, for that. One comment I want to just mention too, if you've never seen it, the Confederate Station Kootenai tribes of the Flathead, they produced a video several years ago called The Spirit of Adatitse, which is available on YouTube, which gives the background story to Samuel Walking Coyote that was actually his stepson and the father of his stepson. And so they're trying to, Samuel Walking Coyote's in all the books, but they're trying to make it, no, it's really a farther beyond that.
That's great. What's the name of the movie?
The Spirit of Adatitse, Atatice. It's available on YouTube.
Yeah.
And they also play it at their new interpreter center too on the Bison Range. So the one question, I'm not sure how. So as you know, one of the biggest issues, and particularly for restoring bison, is changing the livestock industry. People thinking that, oh, if you're bringing in bison, my cattle operation is going to disappear, or my lifestyle with cattle is going to disappear, or the bison are going to destroy my fences, or they're going to spread disease. So how does NBA and other organizations kind of reach out to the cattle industry and other livestock interests to try to both mend fences, but then maybe also particularly change people's minds?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question, Ed. And I've always noticed it's really interesting the different attitudes that you have among cattle ranchers in Montana as opposed to in South Dakota. You don't have nearly the conflicts that you have in South Dakota that you see in Montana. And I think some of it has to do with Custer State Park and the fact that, Custer State Park deliberately managed their herds to maintain their herds and had an auction and sold them off to private ranchers. And so there was, kind of this recognition. Whereas in Montana, it all evolved over, oh my God, these bison in Yellowstone are carrying brucellosis and they're going to infect our cattle and, yada, yada, yada. And then, there was sort of the fear about when American Prairie started, acquiring. And I find that ironic because what they've done is they bought up, their tracts from ranchers that want to sell. It's not like they came in and condemned, the land. But I think that there is, the best thing we can do is just bring the cattle guys in and, have a conversation. And I know where our bison are at here in eastern Colorado. We don't own the ranch. The ranch is owned by the Savory Institute, but we're surrounded by cattle ranches. And we just make sure that, they've got us on speed dial, that if one of our animals gets out, they know to give us a call and we'll get out there as quick as we can to get it back in. But it's a long process because I was appalled, a couple years ago that it was a representative or a senator in the state legislature in Montana said the only mistake we made in the 1800s when we were killing the bison is we didn't finish the job. Yeah. And so there are certain folks that have that attitude that you'll never change.
Right.
But there are others that I think we can work with.
Thanks.
Wow, that's horrible. I don't know how someone could hold that belief about an animal, no matter what they are, but so I have a question more so about the ecosystem and the impact bison have on the ecosystem. So, um, bison are called like ecosystem engineers. And I just wondered if you have seen a difference in your ranch land, or the soil, the birds, the grass, like whatever life there is, like since bison have been on that land. Do you have any change in data or what you've noticed?
Absolutely no, and like I say, the ranch that we're on is owned by the Savory Institute. So we use very much a holistic. We have a grazing plan. We monitor. We talk about the restoration. And the thing that we noticed now, when we came on there in 2015, our stocking rate was about 35 acres per cow calf. We were able to build it up, so we were down to about 28 acres. Now, we went through a really bad drought in 2022. But what I noticed was coming out of the drought, because the bison, the way they managed the land, that land bounced back very quickly. It restored. We may get another chance to test that this year because we haven't had any rain out there, any snow out there, so it's not looking good. But I'd like to refer, and I mentioned at the top that the grasslands are about 40% of the North American ecosystem. And when you think about worldwide, grasslands are about 40% of the environment. There's the steppes of Russia and the savannas down in Africa and the pampas in South America. But in North America, when you think about it, those grasslands are a rainforest. They are incredibly efficient at sequestering carbon. In fact, the University of California, Davis did a report about 7 years ago, that was entitled "Grasslands Are a More Resilient Carbon Trap Than Forest." And if you think about that, trees do a great job of capturing carbon. They are very effective at capturing carbon. But where do they store it? They store a big chunk of that carbon above ground. And so when you get a fire going through there, that carbon all goes right back into the atmosphere. And in fact, the folks in Canada, the reports out of Canada is the last few years, Canadian forests have been net carbon emitters because of the fires. The bison, or the grasses, though, they may only have a foot on top, but they'll have 6 foot of roots down below. And they take that carbon and they sequester it into the soil. And so so that even when a fire comes through there, that carbon stays sequestered in the soil. Well, that's great. They're very effective at doing it, but they can't do it by themselves. Because those grasses will produce about 30% more forage every year than can decompose. You got to have moisture for decomposition. And so if you don't have that grazing animal out there and harvesting that forage and running it through the moisture of their stomach to essentially make it decompose, those grasslands will choke themselves out. But when you have the bison out there that are managing the grass, like I say, the hooves push the seeds down into the soil. They create the little indentures that capture the water, the manure, all of that interaction. And we've seen that firsthand at the West Bijou Ranch with the wildlife that we have out there, the bird species. We have a woman out there that goes and does a bird census every year for that. And so, it's incredible to watch that ecosystem restoration take place. I know somebody said, I might have said MUO, but it's MOU, Memorandum of Understanding that we had,
Perfect. Thank you. We had on one of our submissions for registration for this chat a question wondering if behavior differs between wild herds and herds on a ranch. Do you know if there's a difference?
Well, they'll always be undomesticated. And I say, they're not wild animals. They're undomesticated animals. Now, I don't go stand out in the middle of my herd. They're not going to come and charge me for the most part. But buffalo being buffalo, there's always this jostling going on, particularly between the females to see who's going to be the lead, the alpha. And if you're standing there, you're just the collateral damage. Now, what I've noticed at the ranch where we're at is that when we first brought them in, you had the really tightly bunched behavior of that herd. The more they've been there, the more we've seen them get a little more spread out. They're more, they're a little more accustomed to that, to the point where we're talking about maybe should we bring on some dogs, to have out there, something like that, to kind of replicate some of the predatory behavior, just to keep them bunched in. We're doing some more cross fencing right now to make the paddocks a little tighter to keep them bunched in. But yeah, so herds that are around people will get used to people being there, whereas ones that aren't. But I don't know. Some of the differences that, as far as the Yellowstone bison are concerned, they go to a ranch, they might be amazed to know that they don't have to be around people with cameras and picnic tables and RVs all the time. So yeah. They do get calmer on a ranch, but they'll always be undomesticated. We want to keep them undomesticated because that's what helps them to survive the winters. That's what helps them calve without us having to be there. All of that natural behavior.
Awesome. Does anyone have any last questions? We're almost out of time. I wanted to ask one more time. Okay, then my last question, Dave, is if someone wants to support bison conservation but isn't a rancher, what do you think is the most impactful thing they can do?
Well, now I'm on the board of the National Buffalo Foundation, so I'll make a blatant pitch that to contribute, because the thing that we can do is support more research and education on how do we create healthy herds. And the National Buffalo Foundation is the primary funding source for the Center of Excellence for Bison Studies. We're also we have a traveling bison exhibit that travels around the country that we support. So, they can go on to a National Buffalo Foundation, and we support the Bison Discovery Center. We support that. So, that's a way they can contribute some money to support the growth and development of the business, even though they don't own or aren't an active part of the bison business.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was awesome. Jennifer says this was great information. Thank you. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your expertise, and thank you. This was awesome.
Feel free to list my contact information. My phone number is 303-594-4420. So if anybody has questions, they can always feel free to call me.
That's awesome. Thank you, Dave. And thank you everyone for joining. And I hope you have a great rest of your Saturday. Enjoy Casa Bonita.
Yeah, will do. All right. Take care, guys. Bye.
Bye.